Welcome to A Cult of Personality, esoteric podcast extraordinaire at occultofpersonality.net. I'm your host, Greg Kaminsky. A Cult of Personality podcast is available on iTunes, Spreaker, Stitcher Radio, Acast, and all the best podcast apps. This is episode 175, featuring a few interviews from Masonic Con 2016, including Jim Egan and David Brody. A Cult of Personality podcast is made possible by you, the listeners, and by the subscribers to the A Cult of Personality membership section, and our patrons who support via the A Cult of Personality Patreon campaign. I'd like to remind you that although you're able to listen to this podcast at no charge, the costs to produce it are significant. Your financial contributions ensure the continuity of the free podcast. Please support A Cult of Personality podcast by joining the membership section or donating via the donate button on the website or via Patreon at patreon.com/occultofpersonality. Our Patreon page now features an exclusive RSS feed for patrons, meaning that if you subscribe via Patreon to support the show, you will get some content just for you. And if you're already supporting the show or have done so in the past, my heartfelt thanks, and I salute you. A Cult of Personality podcast is also sponsored by Miskatonic Books, an online store that focuses on the esoteric, occult, ceremonial magic, Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, witchcraft, the Golden Dawn, as well as dark fantasy, classic horror, and supernatural fiction. They carry books by all your favorite esoteric publishers as well. Just visit miskatonicbooks.com. Temple of Lima is a true outer order of the greater mysteries, providing ceremonial initiation, structured training, and regular group work, all in conformity with the principles of the Book of the Law. An investment of time, effort, and commitment is expected from each member. Each is expected to aspire fervently to the great work, to dare, with courage undaunted, to perfect that work, and ever to apply his or her best effort to effect harmony within the order and within the world in general. Founded in service to the AA, College of Thelema seeks to guide the student to an understanding of the law of Thelema. Most especially, this means a deeper understanding of oneself and of one's true will. A combination of instruction techniques is employed, including seminars, written texts, and individual work. For over 40 years, College of Thelema has published journals in the Continuum and Black Pearl, as well as several books on occult subjects maintaining high standards in Thelemic education. Visit Temple of Thelema at www.thelema.org. "300 years ago, 4 lodges came together on St. John's Day at the Goose and Gridiron to form what would one day become the United Grand Lodge of England. Today, the 4 brothers of the Masonic Round Table invite you to join them for 300, Freemasonry's Legacy, Freemasonry's Future, a celebration of 300 years of modern Masonry, at the George Washington Masonic National Memorial, June 23rd and 24th. There will be Masonic speakers like the illustrious Stephen L. Harrison. There will be group discussions that you will be fully participating in. There will be trivia games and prizes. There will be Masonic tours of the area and lots of time for fellowship. Details are evolving. Tickets are on sale for a special price of $99 through the end of February. The price will increase incrementally thereafter. As you buy tickets, you are helping to make this event even better, so please order early on the Eventbrite page and join us for an event 300 years in the making. Don't delay. For information, go to the website at www.themasonicroundtable.com/300. Now, in episode number 175, some interviews from Masonic Con 2016, which was the first occurrence of this public event hosted by the Brethren of Ezekiel Bates Lodge in Attleboro, Massachusetts. Masonic Con 2016 featured a number of excellent presentations that explored a variety of subjects, from Renaissance art to Knights Templar in America and even the Cabala. In these recordings, you'll hear a very brief introduction interview with Brother Aaron Shanty discussing the event, and then an interview with Jim Egan about his extensive research into Elizabethan-era Magus Dr. John Dee and the Newport Tower in Newport, Rhode Island. More information about Egan's work can be found at the Newport Tower Museum and online at newporttowermuseum.com. Finally, we have an interview with David Brody, who specializes in historical fiction, including the Knights Templar in America. More information about Brody's work can be found at davidbrodybooks.com. I also want to mention that Masonic Con 2017 will take place on Saturday, April 29, 2017, at Ezekiel Bates Lodge in Attleboro, Massachusetts, beginning at 9 a.m. Admission is free and it's open to the public. There will be lectures by Angel Millar, Robert Johnson, Piers Vaughn, Richard Casaro, Oscar Aline, Paul Smith, and yours truly. For more information, visit eb1870.org. I'm here with Aaron Shanty at the 2016 Massachusetts, Rhode Island Masonic Con, put on by the Lumen Scientai. If you could say a few words about why you all have decided to put on this huge event today.
All right. Well, first I just want to say it's an honor to actually be on the Cult of Personality, because in no small way, your podcast led me to Freemasonry, or finally making like the final decision to join. So it really is, it's a pleasure to speak with you on the podcast.
Excellent.
It's very influential, great program. So the idea was just, to try to bring Masons together from all over the region, and all the appendant bodies. You have so many rich traditions within the appendant bodies that people aren't really aware of. They might know a little bit about it, but for whatever reason, to make that leap, to actually reach out to somebody is difficult. But if you bring all the bodies together and they're face to face, then it's easier. Here's the application form. Oh, all right. Oh, it's only $10 to join for a year or whatever. And you do all these different things, and people can speak about, what they do and what it's all about. So that was really the concept, to try to promote Masonry, but also promote all the adjunct bodies that do all this wonderful work.
Great. Yeah, that's excellent. Could you just say a few words about some of the speakers and how you selected them? Because it seems like this is a bit of a departure from the standard Masonic fare that I've normally encountered.
Sure. All right. Well, there's definitely yourself, and a wealth of knowledge on esoteric stuff, and that's obviously something that drew me to Masonry. And I've been surprised to find that there are a lot of newer Masons that are really interested in the esoteric stuff. So that's why we tried to get some of those types of speakers. Mm-hmm. Then we have some Masons that are interested in history or archaeology, but in particular, the geometry and building is so key to what we do, or, our philosophy, I should say. And so we have Scott Walter and David Brody, and they've written wonderful books. And Scott Walter's wife, people know them because the Walters, because they've been on the History Channel, and they do stuff, quite often. And then there's some other speakers talking about some entirely different topics. I'm not even quite sure, but just try to be well-rounded in our approach, so that people can come, no matter what their background is and what their interests are, they could find something to be informed and entertained by.
Awesome. So if people listening to this wanted to learn more about Lumen Scienti or hear some of the lectures maybe, how could they access that?
Well, you can go to our Facebook page. There's a Lumen Scienti page on Facebook. And I think starting with your lecture, some of the first lectures that we hadn't started broadcasting them, but now they're on public access here in Attleboro, Massachusetts. But more importantly, they're on the World Wide Web. Follow the links within this Lumen Scienti group on Facebook, and you can watch our lectures on all these different topics. You had Peter Iacobucci talk about the Cabala and some other aspects of it, some of the ancient traditions. And you did a wonderful lecture on the Cabala. That was great as well. I wish we could have had Richard Casaro videotaped, because that was a great lecture too. I really enjoyed that. His book is terrific. Oh, we did have a lecture on Hinduism. Advaita Vedanta Society from Rhode Island come, and they did a lecture, and we learned the paths to God through their tradition. And that's what we're trying to do, is just gain knowledge and not push any particular idea or philosophy, but just let people be aware of these things and see if there's any light of knowledge they can gain from it.
Thank you, Aaron.
All right,
Appreciate
my pleasure. Thank you. It's a singular honor, for sure.
Thank you. And thanks for putting on this event.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Hopefully we'll do it again next year.
I hope so.
All right.
So I'm here at the 2016 Massachusetts, Rhode Island Masonic Con with author Jim Egan. Just saw your presentation a few minutes ago, which was excellent. Highly recommend it. I want to talk with you about some of what you spoke about to us today. You mentioned John Dee and his Monas Hieroglyphica. You said you'd actually translated it from the original. I was wondering if you could just tell us what that was like.
Oh, yeah. Well, when I first read about John Dee and started studying his books, he had a library of 4,000 books, and he wrote 40 books. And some of them were on science, some were on sort of alchemy, some were on history, some were on light, refraction, optics, all sorts of subjects. Because, you see, the Renaissance started in Italy, and then it moved up into Nuremberg, and then into the North countries. But it was slow getting across to England. Well, John Dee studied in the Louvain under Gemofricius, and his best friend was Gerard Mercator, and all of these great scholars, and Petrus Ramus in Paris. And so Dee brought all of this knowledge back, and so he was like way ahead of his time in England, and so he not only was interested in sort of scientific knowledge, which I've sort of described so far, but also the cosmology and how the world operated and such. And so he synthesized all of his wisdom into this one book called the Monas Hieroglyphica, which means sacred symbol of oneness. And he designed a symbol that sort of was used as a rhetorical device in his book. He would turn it upside down and take it apart and show different parts of it. But it's more than a rhetorical device. He felt that this was a talisman, that it had the power of all of the things. And if you could figure out what he was talking about in the 24 theorems of his book, well, then you'd be able to figure it out. Well, the problem is it's written in Latin. And the second thing is that it's been translated 4 or 5 different times. But it was mostly translated, I found, by English scholars, librarians. And they didn't really have a clue, really, what he was talking about. And they end up throwing their hands at the end and saying, this is an alchemical work that has mathematics in it somehow. Well, I read it, and I said, no, this is exactly the opposite. This is a mathematical text. And he wrote it in alchemical language just to be like, to make it cryptic, a little occult, a little hidden. First thing I did was I went to the Library of Congress and got a copy of the book so that I had it in Latin. And then reproduced it for the first time since 1564 in its original size, so I could get a feel for it. He always called it my little book. And so I had the feel for it. And then I hired a Latin translator, and he made a rough translation of the sentences in the book. And so I had an idea that I'm not a Latinist myself, but I can, decipher things once I understand all of the words and where the verbs are and the relationships between the words. And so I sat down at a big table with all of the translations. And one of the translations was done in 1698. And so it has the flavor of the old English words. So this guy knew what John Dee was for certain things. And then other scholars caught on different things. So I went in through sentence by sentence and took all the other translations and what did this guy think, and made my own translation based on what that I know about John Dee. And I started to figure out his clues. Mm-hmm. They're not really, some of them are kind of challenging, but they're all, self-referential. They refer to, like a clue in Theorem 2 will refer to something in Theorem 22. So you sort of have to get the gestalt of the entire book before it starts to make sense. And he says he boils everything down to one chart at the end of his book called "Thus the World Was Created," and in it he summarizes his entire mathematical cosmology. And so, it's hard to explain without a picture of it, but seeing it, he divides the world into two parts: the super celestial and the terrestrial, and then it's all filled with numbers and such. And next to it, he has another chart in which he says he breaks things down into weights and measures and time. And under the time category, he calls the master number, the magisterial number, this number 252. And it's in a couple of places in the text, he talks about 252 and says there are several ways that you can get there. I knew that this was the key to the whole thing, figuring out what 252 was. And so I racked my brain to figure it out. Well, 2 and 5 and 2, that adds up to 9. And then, 250, if you take 2 and double it, you get 4 and then 8 and then 16 and then 32 and then 64 and 128. But then you get 256. That's not 252. And so I knew there was something going on with this special number. And I couldn't figure it out until I decided to go to the main resource that for creative thought, I think, which a resource that has really changed the world of intellectual knowledge as we know it today, the Google. And there was a guy talking about it. His name was Robert Marshall, and he was talking about the number 252 and the number 2520. And he also came up that Buckminster Fuller knew about 252. And so I'm like, Buckminster Fuller? I love Buckminster Fuller. Right. But again, he was kind of hard to understand. He was as cryptic as John Dee was. Right. Talks about what's called the closest packing of spheres. If you have one sphere, exactly 12 spheres fit around it. And then the second layer of the closest packing of spheres, as tightly as you can pack like 12 ping pong balls. Another layer will have 42, and then the next layer is 92, and then 162. And the fifth layer of closest packing of spheres is 252. That's Dee's number. I'm like, whoa, look at what's going on. So, and it's a longer story of why 252, because you could go on to 362 and 490, but it was very important. And so then I found this fellow by the name of Robert Marshall, and he worked with Bucky. In other words, he sent Buckminster Fuller some of his work. Marshall was sort of a born genius with regards to mathematics and numbers, and he had been working sort of independently. And he sent his work to Bucky, and Bucky said, "This is very important, and I've written 2 books called Synergetics 1 and Synergetics 2. Would you be willing to co-write Synergetics 3 with me?" And they agreed to do it, and they started writing it. And 6 months later, Bucky died. And so nobody understood what Marshall was talking about, and Marshall kind of went off, into oblivion. Well, I found out about him on the web, Marshall, and I went out to visit him in California, and we corresponded for 10 years. He taught me everything he knew, all about 252 and these various symmetries that you find within number. And then 6 months ago, Marshall died. I'm the only one that knows. Boom, 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 boom. a little mystery to it.
I know.
But, no, I don't mean to be mysterious about it. It's just that, it's a long story. I don't think, and it's the sort of thing that I have some charts and diagrams in my museum that make it easier to see. And I've written about it in my book, Elizabethan America, that kind of relates geometry and mathematics. And this is what John Dee was into. John Dee was the guy who wrote corollaries and addendums to many of the 465 propositions in Euclid's Elements for the first English translation of Euclid that was done by Billingsley in 1570 in England. And Dee added a preface to it, which is it's an erudite scholarly work on the history of the various arts and sciences. And there's like 20 sciences and he gives a whole page on each one: astronomy, perspective, music, astrology. And he says they're all related to 2 things: arithmetic and geometry. Dee was total math geek. That's how his mind worked. And so he saw things in terms of numbers, and he saw the cosmos, he saw the world as number. And he in his book, he says, there's only one thing in the world that has 1 foot in the supernatural world and 1 foot in the natural world. You know what that is? Number. You can't go out in the woods and find a 3 kicking around, or go out swimming and see a 3. But yet we have number, and we use numbers, and we have triangles that represent 3, and we have 3 trees in a row. But he says that it's magic, and so this was Renaissance magic, and it's not Dee was the first guy to come up with this. The idea of mathematics and geometry being the key to the universe was something that people have studied, all the way from the Cabala and into the Neoplatonists, and then the Arabs were big on the numbers, and then some scribes in medieval times. But in the Renaissance, it kicked in. And there was this whole new appreciation for numbers. And, the guys that we were talking about, Reuchlin and Pico de Mirandola and Martello Ficino, they're all about numbers. I found the Monas hieroglyphic, and I deciphered all 24 theorems. Mm-hmm. And inside this book, because he describes his mathematics, cosmology, and the exact proportioning of the Monas symbol, I found that the Monas symbol was the design plan for the Newport Tower, which, is a longer story, but basically in 1583, John Dee and Sir Humphrey Gilbert sent over a mission to 280 men and 5 ships to colonize Narragansett Bay, and it was called the John D. Bay and River, and this was discovered in 1934 by a guy from Connecticut that went to England and found it in the Elizabethan State Papers. And then a fellow by the name of David Beers Quinn, who is the most noted authority on Elizabethan exploration, he wrote about it in 1970 in his book England and the Discovery of America. And Samuel Eliot Morison in the Northern Voyages, he writes about it. So it's been known for 70 years since it was found in 1934. And it's been well known for the last 40 years, but not one person in Rhode Island has ever talked about it in not one history book. So here you got this huge effort to colonize the New World, and you got this building that nobody knows who built that looks like it's a Renaissance building. I'm like, hello, let's just piece this together. So anyways, I get so excited. I was a professional photographer. I retired from my business, and I spent 5 years studying it, decoding the Monas Hieroglyphica, translating it, and then writing up. I wrote 8 books on the story, and I moved to Newport and opened up a museum right directly across the tower, and nobody gives a shit. What I mean is, the reception I get a lot of people from out of state that come to the tower because they're fascinated. They've seen it on TV, and Scott Walter and some of these people who think it was built by the Templars, they raise a lot of consciousness. But locally in Newport, it's just that thing that's always been in the park. Because it's hidden in plain sight, people don't really take it too seriously. I'm like, that's where I walk my dog. How can you tell me that's a Renaissance building that can be there? Well, if you study it very closely and you look at it, it's filled with clues. And these types of buildings are rare. I mean, it's been known since the 1800s that there's something unusual going on there, but so many people have sort of thrown their thesis at it, the Vikings, the Templars, the Chinese, the Portuguese, that serious academics, they don't want to study it anymore. They're like, I'm not getting involved in that stuff. I got 3 years left at the university, and I don't want to be getting any stuff on me. So, but I didn't have anything. I am a creative photographer. And I know, I think outside of the box, or I'm like, well, let's find out the solution here. And so, what I found was that a lot of the other theorists come to the tower with their own theory, with their own kind of baggage. In other words, the people who think it was built by the Portuguese, they're usually the Portuguese people. And the Scandinavians think the Vikings built it, and the people who study the Templars, they think the Templars. Everyone came to the tower with their own theory. I'm like, well, let's start from the basics here. And the 2 basic clues that we have one are the astronomical alignments that Professor Penhallow found in the 1990s, where stand in a certain part of the park, the sun shines through 2 out of the 3 windows in the park on the winter solstice, and then another alignment at Lunar Minor, which is happens once every 18.6 years through 2 other windows. And I'm like, this is magical. And so I started studying the history of astronomy, history of the camera obscura and sundials and such. And that was one of the main clues for it. And the second clue was that the tower in the year 1677, we know, was owned by the first governor of Rhode Island. And he was one of the original settlers that came to Rhode Island in 1636. And I found out he was here at the exact same time that Roger Williams was. And he was an important guy. And he and his father, William Arnold, became the main trading factors between the Narragansett Indians and the people of Boston. He became fabulously wealthy. And he later became the first governor of Rhode Island, appointed by King Charles in 1663. And his name was Benedict Arnold. You know, people were like, Benedict Arnold? We don't like any guy named Benedict Arnold, the traitor. Well, this is the great-great-great-grandfather of the traitor of the same name. But because his name is Benedict Arnold, he's been written out of Rhode Island history. We don't want to talk about that. How are we going to explain that to the kiddies? We're just like, let's ignore him. Well, this guy was not only appointed by King Charles to be the first governor, but he was also reelected 7 times by the constituency. And when he died, 1,000 people attended his funeral. I don't think I'm getting 1,000 people at my funeral. That's huge, you know. But he's been totally ignored, and he owned the tower. Well, there's a huge clue right there. So I started studying his life, and actually there's a chair at the Redwood Library. It was called the Charter Chair. That was his chair when he was first governor. And on it is this symbol, and it's made up from 3 circles. And so I've studied that as well. And that provided clues that he knew about the astronomy in the tower. The circle on the chair is the exact same size as the image of the solar disk, or the image of the sun, in a camera obscura that's 18.5 feet in diameter. That's the diameter of the tower. In other words, the image of the sun would be exactly the same size as these 3 circles. Anyways, you'd have to sort of see the whole chair and understand what he's talking about. But by piecing all of this stuff together, I started to understand that early colonists knew about this Elizabethan colonization effort. This first governor, when he died, he calls it my stone-built windmill. Well, why would he lie about something like that? Well, there's 4 good reasons. First off, this colonization effort was funded by recusant English Catholics. In other words, Sir Humphrey Gilbert was deeded all of North America in 1577 and given 6 years to colonize the place, but he didn't have enough money. He ran out of money. Actually, he came across in 1578, but he only made it halfway, and he spent all of his money on it, and then he had to go back to fight in Ireland. Anyway, they didn't have enough money, so Walsingham, the head of the Secretary of State, said to this guy, Sir George Peckham, who was a Catholic sympathizer, and at the time the Catholics were being persecuted in England. They were in jails, and they were being fined £20 a month if they didn't attend the English church. And so this guy, Peckham, said, well, if I fund the expedition, can the Catholics that settle in that first colony in the New World have complete freedom of religion? And Walsingham said yes, because he wanted the place to get the Catholics out of England, because they were moving to the continent and taking all their money with them and helping the Catholic cause on the continent. So this was sort of a joint effort between Sir Humphrey Gilbert and these Catholics. And so the point I was trying to make was this happened in the 1500s. Well, in the 1600s, now all of a sudden we were Puritans. We didn't even like the Catholics at all, because the Puritans didn't think that the Protestants had purified the church enough from the Catholic. They didn't want anything about the Pope. Well, if they found out that the building that was in Newport, that the first governor owned, had been originally built by Catholics, they'd tear the damn thing down. Secondly, if the Peckham family found out that their grandparents had paid for this building, and they found the deed in the Elizabethan state papers, they'd make a deal in the back rooms of London, and all of these new colonists would be kicked out of here. They didn't trust anything. So this guy Benedict Arnold called this his stone-built windmill. This sort of as a little white lie to sort of protect it, because he knew some year, maybe around 2016, some genius would be able to figure out the whole thing. But he thought it would be figured out beforehand. Anyway, what happened was The early people in Newport in the 1600s and the 1700s, they knew about it, and that's a longer story. But in 1776, the British occupied Newport during the Revolutionary War, and they trashed the place. They stayed in the biggest mansions, and half the population left town, and they would burn down half of the other houses in town just for firewood. They stayed there for 3 years. They trashed it, and then after that, Newport went into a tailspin. The maritime trade dwindled, and Providence became the place where the roads and the railroads went through. And so that's why there are all these buildings from the 1700s that still remain in Newport, because it got lost for a century. And it wasn't until the 1800s that the rich people from Philadelphia and New York discovered that this was a great place to spend the summers, and they built all these mansions on Bellevue Avenue. And then now you got the la-di-da whole Newport thing that's now today. But in the early days, Newport and Rhode Island was the only place that guaranteed freedom of religion and freedom of speech. And people always say, oh, well, that's Roger Williams. And, well, it wasn't Roger Williams. Roger Williams ran Providence. Newport was 5 times the size of Providence. And there was this governor, Benedict Arnold, who was governor for the first 20 years of the history of the state, that ensured that the Quakers and the Jews and the Sabbatarians could come to Newport and worship as they pleased. So this guy was very important, but as soon as you take him out of the equation, then you're missing the huge clues. And the other thing is that this guy John Dee, who I mentioned, who was the great scholar in 1583, that I claim not only convinced Queen Elizabeth she had a legal right to North America, but designed the tower in 1583. He hired a scryer. A scryer is a guy who can read a crystal ball, and they held seances for the next 8 years. This guy by the name of Edward Kelly. And Dee wrote down everything that was in that they had in the seances. Now, Dee said, I never saw any of the angels, but I believed Kelly, and he wrote down everything, a transcript, very detailed, and he buried his book, his diary, in a box in his backyard. And about 50 years later, an antiquarian bought his house, found the book, dug it up, and they published it. And what happened between John Dee and some spirits back in the Elizabethan days, and they were making fun of him because now we were in the scientific revolutions, we were Puritans, and we didn't talk to angels, please. So John Dee has been discredited. You can Google him right now, and it's all about this magic and all about the special talking to angels and the Enochian alphabet and all of this stuff. And so all of this stuff about John Dee being a scholar, being a mathematician. John Dee invented the symbols for proportions, those 2 dots that we use. Mm-hmm. And he also was the first person to use 144 different words in the English language. He coined 144 different words. Yeah. Wow. Now, Shakespeare, did 250, but John Dee, that's because he knew Latin and he knew Greek, and he brought these words to the language. Words like unit and solstice and vertex. He was the first person to use these words. These are brilliant things. Mm-hmm. But anyway, because he once talked to the angels, or believed that you could, he's been thrown out of history. Well, everybody believed you could talk to the angels back then. Queen Elizabeth, she had an astrolabe, and she was all about the whole thing. So I got so excited, I opened this museum, and I've had over 5,000 people from all over every state in the Union. That's and every amazing. Country in the world. But very rarely do I get people from Newport or from Rhode Island that come. So that's basically the thrust of it.
Well, thank you. If people wanted to learn more about your work, the museum, or support you, get your books, how could they do that?
Well, my museum is only 50 steps northeast of the tower at 152 Mill Street, and in Newport. You just come up Mill Street and right at the top, right opposite the tower. So if you find the tower and you just look to the north, you'll see a white building, and right in the center you'll see my sign, Newport Tower Museum. Come in and chat with me, and I'll show you more details about my thesis. And since I wrote the 5 books, I've also written about 7 or 8 other books. Mm-hmm. Newport is so rich in history, people haven't even tapped into the whole thing. And when you're on the right track for something, which I believe I am here, you're bound to find more things that will correspond with it, And just because other people ignore it doesn't mean I do. I'm interested. I'm doing this sort of for my own enjoyment, but also it's an important story for the history of Newport, the history of Rhode Island, the history of New England, history of America, America, in the history of the world. I'm talking about a Renaissance building in America. That doesn't happen very often, and that's why people might think that it's outlandish or whatever. But it doesn't matter to me. Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, and if we don't study it, if you don't focus on it, you aren't going to see it.
That's right.
I just have a good outlook on it, and I'm learning too, and I'm growing too, and that's what's important to me. And the part of it is, as a professional photographer, I had to think outside of the box for 40 years.
Right.
So I brought that same training to my studies, historical studies, and so I see things that people don't really see. A lot of historians are librarians, and librarians are taught to keep things in the box and things in their right positions. And this is what we know. This is primary data. This is what we have. And look, the first governor said it was his windmill. How much more do you want, Jim? Well, is there a possibility that a politician might lie? There's a question you can ask, or the question of why did he might have had to lie? Maybe he was forced to. Well, but that's a longer story that you'll have to come to the museum to find out. I'm going to tell you everything.
Well, thank you, Jim Egan. Your work is really fascinating, and I find it really intriguing, especially the John Dee connection. So thank you for sharing with us. Appreciate it very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you very much.
David Brody, I want to thank you for agreeing to speak with me today about your research and your writing. For people who aren't already familiar with you and your work, maybe you could just give us a little bit of a brief background on who you are and what you do.
Sure. Thanks for having me. So I'm a lawyer by trade, but maybe 20 years ago I started writing fiction, and originally I wrote legal thriller type things. And then at some point I stumbled into a local legend. I live up in Westford, Massachusetts, up near Lowell, and we have a legend called the Westford Knight. And that legend is that 1398 and 1399, a Scottish explorer by the name of Henry Sinclair island hopped his way across the North Atlantic, following in the footsteps of the Vikings, and ended up in Nova Scotia and then eventually in New England and found his way to Westford, Mass. And so I sort of dove down that rabbit hole back in 2006, 2007. And I've been foraging around down there for the last decade ever since, looking at all these different sites and artifacts scattered around New England that pretty strongly seem to indicate that there is a history of exploration after the Vikings and before Christopher Columbus, and then taking it a step further, even before the Vikings, going back to groups, perhaps the ancient Phoenicians or Brendan the Navigator and the Irish. But generally speaking, what I do and what I do through my fiction, this is historical fiction, and I've written 5 of these books. What I do is I explore these sites and these artifacts and try to weave a story around them, but the idea being to convey to the reader this hidden corner of history, that there are sites and there are artifacts in New England that seem to indicate that waves of explorers have been here. So I call my series the Templars in America series, because I think that the Templars are part of that group that I just spoke about, came over with Prince Henry Sinclair in the late 1300s. And it does seem like all the groups that have come over here are either tied directly or indirectly to the medieval Knights Templar.
Fascinating. Now, I've heard speculation that even Christopher Columbus himself was somehow connected to, maybe it wasn't the Templars directly, maybe one of their descendant orders or sympathizers. But it seems like much of the exploration of this land has come from that direction.
Yeah, I've heard that as well about Columbus. There's no smoking gun on that, as I say, but there is some circumstantial evidence that does tie him back to the Templars. I think the reason why many researchers, including myself, seem to land at the Templars as the most likely candidates for having come over here is, it goes back to motive, means, and opportunity, and they had all those. For your listeners, I'm sure are familiar that they were outlawed in 1307, but their treasure, was never found, and they had a huge naval power. They had ships to make the crossing. They probably, through their time in Jerusalem in the Middle East, they probably were able to acquire some of the ancient Phoenician sailing charts and astronomical abilities they knew they had to get out of Europe at some point, because at some point the Pope was going to come after them again. They were able to find safe haven in Scotland for a while, but they knew that was going to end. So if you just sort of look at all the pieces of evidence, who had the ability and the motivation and the opportunity to go bouncing across the Atlantic looking for a safe haven, and it always comes back to the Templars.
It's a really interesting story. One of the questions that arises in my mind is, do you think that their arrival in the New England area was coincidental, or was there some specific reason that they might have gone to what's now Westford, Massachusetts?
So if we go back to the gentleman I mentioned earlier, Prince Henry Sinclair, he was a Scottish nobleman, and this is again the late 1300s, and his family is most famous. His grandson ended up building Roslin Chapel, so his family is famous for that. And going backwards, his family was one of the original 9 founding members of the Knights Templar, married a Sinclair woman. So the family has these ties going backwards to the Templars, forwards to Roslin Chapel, forward to Freemasonry. The family was a hereditary Grand Master of Scottish Rite Freemasonry for about 200 years after this. But Prince Henry Sinclair himself, although he was a Scottish nobleman, his mother was a Norse woman. And so not only did he rule in Scotland around the Roslin area, but he also ruled the Orkney Islands, which at that time were part of Norway. So the theory is that on his mother's side, he would have had access to Viking oral history, Viking charts, Viking maps, because again, the Orkney Islands are on the northern side of Scotland and historically part of Norway. And so if you think about how the Vikings came across, they basically island hopped their way across, starting in Scandinavia and then to the Orkney Islands, Shetland Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and then across to Labrador and down to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. You're never really at sea for all that long. But it makes perfect sense that Prince Henry Sinclair, as part of his family history and family legend, would have known of those journeys and could easily have repeated them.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that these initial early visitors to this land from Europe were in search of anything specific, or was this more an interest in sort of claiming the land?
As much as it would make a better story if there was some, holy grail left here or something, I don't think that. I think it was really a question of the Templars. They wanted to get out of Europe. When we're talking about the Templars, we're talking about the vestiges, the families that were left over, the outlawed families. Some of them went to Scotland, some to Portugal, some went underground. But there's this vestiges of these families that knew that they needed to find a safe haven, both for themselves and for whatever treasures they had taken from Jerusalem and brought back to Europe with them. And so it just became a question of where's the land of plenty? Where can we go for a safe haven, far away from the church? It made sense to, again, if the Vikings had been here and people like Prince Henry Sinclair had memory and knowledge of those excursions, why not repeat them? Not to mention the fact that there was wonderful economic opportunities here through trade and harvesting timber and trading for beaver pelts and whatever, fishing, whatever. So there's lots of economic reasons to come as well.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Could you give the listeners a little bit of insight into what it was like for you to encounter and then try to decipher some of these archaeological artifacts that led you to your discoveries?
I'll talk about some of the artifacts that indicate the wave of travel right around the year 1400. So I think the strongest piece of evidence in support of that is the stone tower in Newport, Rhode Island, called the Newport Tower. There's just so many things about the architecture of that scream medieval Scottish architecture. I mean, the traditional historians all claim that it was a windmill built in the 1670s by Governor Benedict Arnold, but there's so much about it. Again, the architecture is Romanesque. There's a fireplace on the second floor, which you would never do for a gristmill because the risk of fire is so great. And that fireplace has a unique double flue, almost like devil horn shaped flue system, which is really specific to 14th century Scottish architecture. The unit of measurement to build it was a Scottish ell. The style is almost identical to Temple Church built by the Knights Templar in London. There was some carbon dating that was done on a piece of a shell that was found during archaeological dig. It was attached to a piece of mortar, and the carbon dating of that came back to the early 1400s. There's just so many things of both the architecture, stylistic point of view, but also scientifically, whether it's unit of measurement or the carbon dating. But it also comes back to 14th century Scotland. So that's, to me, the Newport Tower. There's some astronomical alignments that you would never have a reason to do if you're a colonist. There's just so much about that tower that screams Templars, 14th century in Scotland. So there's that. There's also the site that I first stumbled upon when I was doing my research, which is called the Westford Knight site. So again, the legend is that Prince Henry Sinclair came across in 1398 and 1399 and ended up in Westford, Mass. And it sort of makes sense. The story holds together. Westford's the highest hill in all of eastern Massachusetts. It's a traditional gathering spot for Native American tribes. Presumably, Sinclair would have had negotiated safe passage. He purportedly spent the first winter up in Nova Scotia with the Mi'kmaq tribe, and then the Mi'kmaq sort of probably escorted him down to New England, again, safe passage. But while he was climbing the hill, one of his men died, and as was the custom in medieval times, they carved an effigy in the rock ledge to memorialize his death. And we still have that medieval sword carved in the rock ledge, and there may be more than a sword. There may have been an entire effigy with the head and the shoulders and the shield of the knight. A lot of that's faded away, but the sword is still very visible today. So that's called the Western Knight carving, and we think that, again, is evidence of his journey and of the fallen knight being buried nearby. And then a little further downstream from that is a second artifact called the Boat Stone, and it's another medieval image. It's kind of a Nor, Knor. It's a medieval ship with a crossbow arrow and the numbers 184 carved onto it. And if you pace 184 paces into the woods in the direction of the arrow, and you find the remains of an old foundation, and we think that might have been their wintering spot where they made camp. So we have some work still to do on that. But there's some artifacts, and so the story sort of holds together, I like to say, in and around Westford. And then it would have been his group that went down further south to the Newport area to build the Newport Tower. Near the Newport Tower, there's another stone called the Narragansett Rune Stone. Again, runic being a Scandinavian script, and the runes in particular on the stone tie back to another rune stone up in Maine called the Spirit Pond Rune Stone. It's actually 3 Spirit Pond Rune Stones, and that in turn ties to an artifact in Minnesota called the Kensington Rune Stones, which dated 1362. But these 3 rune stones, even though they're thousands of miles apart and were found 100 years apart, share some unique runic characteristics that are not found in Scandinavia, and lead us to believe that they're all connected one to the other. And again, they're all connected probably to this group of explorers in the late 1300s, early 1400s coming across, and we think looking for safe haven, looking for a place to settle, and looking for a way to get away from the reach of the church.
I'm curious because when I listen to you present your research and I look at some of the evidence, being a layman, non-expert, it seems pretty convincing to me. And I'm curious about the feedback you've gotten both from your readers as well as from maybe people who have a more vested interest in the subject.
Yeah, that's sort of what struck me on it too, because I like to joke that I'm a lawyer by trade, and as such, I don't normally care about things like the truth. Okay? And that always gets a big laugh.
That's a great line.
Yeah, but it's a line, obviously. But the truth is, as a fiction writer, even though I'm writing fiction, it's historical fiction, there needs to be enough, meat on the bone to convince my readers that I'm not just making stuff up. And so, first researching this stuff, I was blown away by the number of artifacts. And you can sort of excuse one or two of these. Oh, it's a hoax, or it's a modern day forgery, or these really aren't runic letters or plow marks, and you can go a little bit with that, but at a certain point, there's just so many of them, and we call it the totality of the evidence. There's just so much of it, and that's the thing about it that really gets me. And I think that the feedback I get from my readers obviously is, we're with you on it, but I don't typically hear from people who don't agree with me as much. That's just not the way things work. I give a lecture, and the people who agree with me come up afterwards and shake my hand, and the people who don't slink away in the back of the back door, and sort of roll their eyes and off they go. But I do think that even in the past 8-9 years since I've been doing this, there's been a huge turnaround as far as people, objective observers, sort of looking at this and saying, yeah, it makes sense, that the evidence makes sense, but also just the whole idea. To me, the whole idea that the Vikings came over here around the year 1002, let's say AD, and then no one came back again for almost 500 years till Columbus came. To me, that seems outlandish. Whereas, other people think it's outlandish to think someone did come back. Oh, we have the Vikings and we have Christopher Columbus, and no way did anyone come in between. That would be the surprising thing to me. Like, why didn't people come back? There's a lot of good reasons to come here, economically and otherwise. Why didn't people come back? And yet, for somehow, we get this whole 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We all learned that in second grade, and to us, it's hard to get past that there might have been people before him. But I think once you sort of show people, it would make sense that they would have come back. And let's be more specific. So we've always known that they came as far as Lonsdale Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. Then the idea is they sort of touched their toe, and then the Eskimos scared them off, which always, the Eskimos with their wooden weapons and their bone weapons versus the steel of the Vikings. But somehow the Eskimos scared the Vikings away. That never made sense to me either.
Right.
But we now know they went down to the southern tip of Newfoundland. We just saw this. Nova did a wonderful show on PBS about a month ago to a place called Point Rosie. So we know that 300 miles closer, and now we're only 300 miles away from Nova Scotia. Once we get to Nova Scotia, we're just hop, skip, and a jump down to the New England coast. So we're starting to see more and more evidence of the fact that the Vikings did come further down. And let's look at the Icelandic sagas themselves. What did the Norse tell us about their trip? They said, for example, they spent a snowless winter where the cattle grazed. Well, you're not going to do that in northern Newfoundland. I'm sorry. You're not going to have a snowless week in northern Newfoundland, okay?
Right.
In the winter. So, Cape Cod, that makes sense. We know that they found grapes to make wine. Again, grapes don't grow that far north. They do grow in New England. We know that even at the Lonsdale Meadows site, Brigida Wallace, one of the lead archaeologists, has been writing about this a lot recently. They found butternuts. It comes from a butternut tree, and those trees don't grow that far north. She thinks, and I think she's right, that these were acquired further south and brought up to what she calls a layover spot in northern Newfoundland, probably halfway between Cape Cod and Greenland. But again, these butternuts prove that they came further south. So there's lots of evidence, right, within the Icelandic sagas themselves, talking about things that indicate that the Vikings did come down to the New England area. So once we sort of get our foot in the door and say, okay, well, the Vikings are here in the early 11th century, why couldn't Prince Henry Sinclair have come back and just repeated the trip in the 1300s? And other people in the 1100s and 1200s, I think there were waves of explorers coming back and forth across the North Atlantic, throughout that 500-year period between the Vikings and Columbus.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. This is one of the reasons why I love the study of history, is because the books have been written, but the story is not fully fleshed out yet. As we can see, by your research and many others, we're still learning about our past. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear you say that, Greg, because obviously I feel passionately about this, but to me, it's not even really that close to call. And I'm still surprised once in a while when I do hear from people who say, oh, you don't have any evidence. Well, no, we have tons of evidence. I mean, we really have a boatload of evidence. Now, you may not like the evidence, and you may not find it carries the day, but there's a ton of evidence. It's just all, I go on for hours through all the different sites and artifacts that indicate these explorers were here. Again, you might not like it, but there's a ton of it out there.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's going to eventually win the day, is the amount of evidence, the dedication of the people researching it. And I think, even if you don't want to be convinced, at some point, like you said, this idea of the totality of the evidence begins to tip the scales.
It's hard to argue with hard science. So Scott Walter, who is the forensic geologist out in Minnesota, who was hired to study the Kensington runestone, you can disagree with what Scott's interpretation of what the message of the stone itself is, but his scientific work, his geological work on that stone, in which he conclusively proved that it had been weathering outside in the elements for at least 200 years at the time it was found in the 1890s. Okay, so it's old in the 1890s, really old, older than any colonial settlements in Minnesota. I mean, you can't argue with that, and that proves that the thing was left hundreds of years ago, and it's written in a Scandinavian script. The Native Americans didn't speak runic and didn't have iron tools to carve into the stone. I mean, it really proves that it is an ancient artifact. Now, what it says and what it means, we can debate all that stuff, but the science is 100% conclusive. It's not a modern forgery as people claim it is. It's just not. The science proves that. And so you need to come up with an explanation that explains the stone, at the same time recognizing the science that tells us it's not modern. And when I say modern, it's not 1890s when it was found. It goes back way, way further than that. So if people, and we always invite people like, all right, if you have another explanation for all this that takes into account all the science and all the evidence, then fine, let's hear it. But the whole idea you're just going to stick your head in the sand and say, no, that's not really, that's not really an argument. That's not really an intellectual pursuit. And we like to say everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. So you have to come up with a theory that takes the facts into account. To me, the only one that does is the theory that, yes, there are waves of the explorers coming across here during the 14th century.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I can't stress enough how important I think it is for people to keep an open mind and to not stop at, what they were taught in history class, because that is certainly not the end of the story.
And Greg, we see this all the time. We saw this discovery of the Göbekli Tepe site in Turkey within the last decade. We were always taught that civilization, quote unquote, began 6,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia.
Right.
You've all heard that story. 6,000 years ago. It turns out that that's wrong by a factor of 2. It's not 6,000, it's 12,000 years ago. So it's not like going from 6,000 to 7,000 to 8,000. No, it went from 6,000 all the way to 12,000 years ago. Well, it's no one's fault, but it just shows that not only does our history change, it changes by huge amounts in the blink of an eye. So, and to me, we already know the Vikings are here, so we don't have to change history at all in North America. We've got the Vikings in the 11th century. Why can't we? And we have Christopher Columbus in the 15th century. Why can't we have someone coming in between that time, such as Prince Henry Sinclair? We don't even have to change the dates. We just have to fill in between.
Yeah, and you're right. I think it does seem more logical that people would have been back from Europe in between those times. That seems more likely than not.
Right, and it's like, well, how come there was no recorded history? Well, again, it's like your favorite fishing hole, or you got a really good economic deal going. You don't publicize it. You don't tell your competition what you're doing. You keep that kind of stuff quiet. So that's not surprising that it wasn't written down.
Good point. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of your books for people listening if they're interested in learning more and hopefully picking them up and reading them.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. So the first book, and it focuses again on Newport Tower and the Western Knight legend. It's called Cabal, C-A-B-A-L. And you can appreciate with the root of that word, Greg, being an expert on the Kabbalah, the Cabal of the Western Knight. And that focuses a lot on what we just talked about today, which is the 14th century journey by Prince Henry Sinclair. These are modern-day novels in which the readers sort of go along for a ride with the main characters who are out looking at these sites. And of course, it's a thriller, and there's a bad guy, and there's a romantic interest. And I think I love history that is alive and dramatic and passionate and mysterious. I just think that learning about history through fiction is a really fun way to do it. Some of your listeners may like things that are more academic, but for those who enjoy a good thrill ride, at the same time they're getting their history lesson, sort of a good vehicle. So there's 5 of these books in the series, and they all look at different sites and artifacts, mostly in New England. The last one, which is the one I spoke about at the conference where you and I recently attended, focuses in on some of the Brendan the Navigator, 6th century Irish explorers that I think came over here and built some of these stone chambers. That's the last one in the series, and that one's called The Isaac Question. And I would recommend to readers either start at the beginning with Cabal of the Western Knight, or you can jump in at the 5th one, The Isaac Question, if you happen to be Irish or have an interest in these stone chambers. That's a good place to jump in as well. Those 2 are probably the ones that are of most interest to new readers.
Nice. Well, I definitely recommend those. I also love learning about history through fiction. One thing I wanted to ask you about, since you have researched this as well, is these stone chambers that exist throughout New England and other parts of the country. Do you have any inkling as to the purpose of these structures?
So the ones I've looked at are in New England and also in the Hudson Valley in New York. And then the one in particular I've spent a lot of time at is one in Upton, Massachusetts. Upton is out near Hopkins, not far from the beginning of the Boston Marathon start line. And that chamber fascinated me because it's a beehive-like chamber. It's a narrow entrance, and you go down a little tunnel, and then it opens up into almost like an igloo beehive type thing. And it's very reminiscent of a lot of the burial chambers in the British Isles. And again, it's similar because the opening faces west, such that the summer solstice sunset would protrude through the opening and illuminate the back wall. It's very similar to what we have at places like Newgrange and Bryn Kennedy B in Wales and other. They're called burial chambers, even though people aren't buried there, but they're oriented towards the summer solstice sunset. The west being sort of the area of death, so
right.
That's why they're called burial chambers. And this one. Most of these chambers have been dismissed as colonial root cellars. And the fascinating thing about the one in Upton was when the town took it over and did some archaeological work, they did something called luminescence testing. And so you can take soil from behind the stones and you can determine when the last time the soil saw the light of day and use that as an aging technique. And I won't get into all the details, but it turns out that the luminescence testing conclusively proved that this particular chamber is pre-colonial. There's a cluster of dates that mark it around 1400, Prince Henry Sinclair's time. That got my attention, obviously. Another cluster of dates that mark it back at 1000 AD, and even another cluster of dates that bring it back even further. We might have had sort of repairs along the way. But the important thing from that chamber is it takes us out of the realm of colonial root cellar. So now we're left with, is it a Native American structure? I don't think it is. It could be. My research indicates that it's probably not. I mean, the Native Americans did do some stone chambers, but they tended to leave the roof open because they used them as vision quest structures where the spirits would come down, and they believe the spirits would only come down to them if there was an open roof over their head so the spirits could penetrate. So they tended not to top off their structures, and this has a massive roof slab over the top. And again, the chamber is so reminiscent of. There's a corbelling technique in the way they built the chamber. It's so reminiscent of things in the British Isles that, to me, that's what it looks like. And the most likely candidate in my mind is Brendan the Navigator, a 6th century Celtic Irish monk who, legend has it, with 14 other monks and 2 quote-unquote pagans came across. The pagans, in my mind, might have been ancient Druids who would have been familiar with these burial chambers. And there are other sites around New England that seem to indicate exploration and travel here by a group of Celtic, Druidic, Irish explorers around the 6th century. There's a site down in Connecticut called Gungywamp, which has some carvings and chambers. Dr. Barry Fell, a Harvard professor, found a bunch of sites up in Vermont. I won't get into the details of those, but again, there's a lot of evidence that sort of clusters around the 6th century Celtic explorers, and that would make sense as far as who would have built at least some of these chambers. Some of them are colonial root cellars, no doubt about that, but not all of them. There's just too many of them that are oriented towards solstice and equinox, sunsets and sunrises, and other kind of astronomical alignments that the colonists wouldn't have bothered with, but the ancient Druids and Celts would have.
Just fascinating. Boy, it's really interesting. I hope that your research continues to yield new discoveries, but
me too.
What you've already brought forth, though, is so rich that it's hard to put a value on it, really. I don't know that you could, because learning the true history of the land we live in is something, it feels like a birthright. We should be able to know this, but only through the work of people like you are we able to. So
I love it. The birthright, that's a really good way to describe it, Greg. That's exactly what it is. And we joke about it that I hope I continue to find stuff, but I've been foraging around for 8 or 9 years into these dusty corners of history, and I keep thinking that I'm going to run out of things to find and run out of things to write about. But I'm on my 6th novel now, and I keep finding more stuff, and it's a treasure trove, and I'm having a heck of a time with it too. And I think you and I met at a conference last weekend, and I think you saw the energy of the other researchers. There's a lot of energy and excitement around these finds, and we're all out there, but it seems like all of the work we're doing, it corroborates each other. I'll do something and another researcher will find something and we'll find out that, it corroborates each other's work. And that's satisfying as well, because we're hopefully on the right track.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree. I found it extraordinary the way that all the presentations on Saturday sort of fit together. I don't know if that was by design or not, but it was extraordinary.
you're right, the energy that the researchers bring to it, and it's infectious. And I think learning has that effect on people. And all I can say is, thank you for the work you've done, and I look forward to continuing the journey with you.
Well, thank you, Greg. I appreciate it. I think your work, we're going to find it dovetails right in there as well. So another chapter in the story.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, David Brody. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
In the Occult of Personality membership section, you'll find a wide-ranging roundtable discussion with some great friends, including Father Anthony Sylvia, Frater O of the Whence Came You podcast, and Rudolph, who you'll meet very soon. Don't miss that excellent exclusive recording. Just go to occultofpersonality.net/membership and sign up if you haven't already. It's the best way to support the podcast while receiving access to a tremendous amount of additional exclusive content. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.